Thanks everybody for joining us. I really appreciate you coming in and listening on this important topic on food justice today. It's my real pleasure to introduce Dr. Julian Aygeman, who's a professor of urban and environmental policy and planning at Tufts University. I'll just give a few brief bio points. He's the originator of the increasingly influential concept of just sustainabilities, the intentional integration of social justice and environmental sustainability. He's the author, editor of 12 books, including Cultivating Food Justice, Race, Class, and Sustainability, which I know will come up some today. I've had the real pleasure of working with Dr. Aygeman as a member of the ACSP Climate Action Task Force and his commitment to sustainability in that venue as well. So Dr. Aygeman, thank you for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. And I'm very happy to be speaking to you today. And first thing I like to do is to offer a land acknowledgement that I'm speaking to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts, on the traditional territories of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people. And I would like to pay my respects to their people, their elders, their past, present, and future, and to commit to a principle of respect and care as part of this meeting. So I want to jump straight in. Unless we acknowledge a real problem, then we're not going to get solutions. And the problem, as I see it, is we cannot separate hunger from racist urban planning. That might seem like a stretch for some of you, but I'm going to expand on that as I go through my talk. And some of it is based around a short piece that I wrote in The Conversation on how urban planning and housing policy helped create a food apartheid in US cities. But hold that thought, we can't separate hunger from racist urban planning. So what I'm actually saying is white supremacist or racist urban planning has an embodied effect in terms of hunger. And let's just think of a few phrases that are being bandied around: food deserts, food swamps, food apartheid. Food deserts is probably the most common phrase, areas with limited access to reasonably priced, healthy and culturally relevant foods. Food swamps are kind of the same, but a preponderance of stores selling fast and junk food. But one of the critiques that has been made of these terms, food deserts, food swamps, is that they ignore the historical roots and the deeply racialized nature of food access, where white communities basically in the US have much more access and availability of healthy, reasonably priced food. So many scholars, including food justice scholar Ashanti Reese, suggest the term food apartheid. And she says food apartheid is intimately linked to policies and practices, current and historical, that come from a place of anti-Blackness. Now, one of the great scholars, I think, who used to be at Portland State, Nate McClintock, and who's now at one of the universities in Montreal, Nate did a chapter in my book, Cultivating Food Justice, which I think is going to turn out to be a classic in urban political ecology. And he really traces the origins of the Oakland food desert, not to some kind of nominal yes or no decisions made by the economists at one supermarket chain, but he traces it back to structural processes that have restricted healthy access to food for residents of the lowlands, the flatlands of Oakland. And he says this is because of industrial location, residential development, city planning, racist mortgage lending. We could add as well the many freeways that intersect the flatlands. And the impact of this has caused capital devaluation in the flatlands, which ultimately created the city's food desert. Cities' food deserts are part of a historical process. And that quote from Nate's work could apply to Boston, it could apply to it could apply to any US city. So, key point, we can't understand hunger outside city racist urban planning. Similarly, we cannot understand food deserts, I think, outside of this idea of capital devaluation, capital flight from neighborhoods caused by all of these processes, whether it was racialized covenants, whether it was, single family zoning, exclusive zoning, exclusionary zoning, redlining, all of these processes individually have an effect on segregation, but cumulatively, I would argue that probably nobody has done segregation better than apartheid South Africa, other than us in the United States. And the Group Areas Act obviously was a very deep and political and ideological move. Ours, white supremacy, is it an ideology? Probably is. But I think we have to understand these areas of deprivation as part of the object, in many ways, of white supremacist urban planning. And, in a different lecture, I would give you a quote, and you can have it in this lecture as well. Urban planning is the spatial toolkit of white supremacy. Urban planning is the spatial toolkit of white supremacy. I frequently remind our students at Tufts of that, and that we can do something about it. That's the positive, is we can do something about it. So McClintock's work, he comes up with some beautiful phrases, and he says that today, Oakland represents a crude mosaic of parks and pollution, privilege and poverty, whole foods and whole food deserts. That's, I think, very poignant. This is the legacy of these planning practices that happened, beginning at the beginning of the early 20th century. Here in Boston, I just want to flag some work that I did looking at the implementation of a rezoning, Article 89 rezoning, which happened in 2013 in Boston. The then mayor, Thomas Menino, basically felt that two neighborhoods, Roxbury and Dorchester, were food deserts, and they are food deserts. So he thought, let's rezone for urban agriculture. Now, you might say, oh, hey, good on the mayor. But people weren't very happy about this. These same neighborhoods had been dumped on, redlined, blockbustered, they'd had all things going on. And then the mayor says, we want to put an urban agriculture zone in your neighborhood. And the reason I call this article Silence is Not Consent, Plantation Poison and the Politics of Planning is that one city councillor really had a knee-jerk and visceral reaction to the mayor's proposal and said, we're not going to work on the mayor's plantation. And of course, saying those words immediately brought this into a huge political fight. So the councillor talked about, we're not going to work on the mayor's plantation. You will be poisoned by any food if you eat it, because all the mayor is planning on doing is putting a membrane and then 8 inches of new topsoil. So we can see how urban agriculture can become politicized. Now, again, intellectually, yes, these neighborhoods need this kind of attention, but the way in which it was carried out was seen as disregarding people's choice. Eventually, the program went through, but it was done with the city having to backtrack and redo the consultation. So it's just a salutary lesson. We can think of something as good, urban agriculture, greening neighborhoods, but we still have to consult with the people concerned. Second problem I think we need to think about is the food movement as a dominant narrative. And we know that narrative. I've shown you 2 pictures here, the farmer's market and buy fresh, buy local. Those are the 2 narratives. Purchasing local food, organic food, vote with your fork. That's what the alternative food movement is about. It's saying, let's vote for environmental sustainability, local produce, biologically diverse polycultures, avoiding the use of synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, small family farms, mom and pop. You know, it's that America that some people want to evoke. And the buy fresh, buy local sticker there, I think, says it all. Look at what that is saying. Is there anything in there, crop-wise, that really evokes interculturalism, multiculturalism, America as an immigrant society? What we're shown here is an imaginary that has been very carefully calculated to, I think, portray an America of the past, not America of the present or the America of the future. Similarly, a lot of the farmers' markets are not representative of local communities. We have an elite food movement, predominantly white, predominantly middle class. And in the book, Cultivating Food Justice, we talk about the paradox of the monocultural food movement that wants polycultural cultivation. This idea of polycultural cultivation as being more sustainable and more healthy in terms of predator-prey relations. So in many ways, then, the food movement has become a group of like-minded individuals who share same values, share the same proclivities, and have come to very similar conclusions about how our food system should change. So the food movement, I think we could argue, is an exclusive movement. It is not an inclusive movement. And when the high priest of the alternative food movement, Michael Pollan, says things like, don't eat anything your great-grandmother wouldn't recognize as food, what he seems to ignore or not understand is that many people's great-grandmothers came from social and economic contexts where they didn't have the choice of what they ate. They were given things from the table, or when they immigrated to the United States, their names were changed and certain foods were demonized as well. Michael Pollan, as many writers in the food movement have, is a very privileged positionality. They are good people. They're saying the right things, but what they don't understand is the effects of their narratives and the alternative meanings that their narratives might hold for people of color, especially, and for lower income people. So the food movement, with its exclusive narrative, has exclusive values and meanings written into that narrative. What might we think about? How might we think differently? How might we think about a more inclusive food movement? Well, the alternative food movement, what I've here called the food movement, needs to really think about those people who are most affected by food insecurity and food injustices. And those are the people who are going to food kitchens. I mean, a lot of people are going to food banks now, not just the working poor. But imagine a movement, a true movement for good, accessible, culturally relevant food. It would incorporate the Whole Foods crowd, but it would also incorporate people like these, the people who are most harmed by the food system. We would have a much greater chance of change if the alternative food movement could reach out more broadly. Similarly, it's like the environmental movement and the environmental justice movement. There's no difference. The alternative food movement represents the environmental movement. The food justice movement represents the environmental justice movement. Why do we have these exclusivities in US social movements? So we've got the environmental movement and the environmental justice movement. We've got the food movement and the food justice movement. We have the climate movement and then the climate justice movement. We always seem to have in the US a justice-based mirror image of the main social movement. We also need to think of local food systems as being racialized and what the sociologists Omi and Winant call racial projects. These that picture that I've shown you there, it could be anywhere. It could be in any inner urban area in the United States. Food is part of a racialized undertaking. It's a political undertaking. Racial hierarchies are established and racial subjectivities are created. So we need to then understand not only the role of urban planning in creating food injustice, food deserts, but we also need to think of a more sociological and political and economic idea of any undertaking in the United States as being a racial project, a racialized project. So I think the two overlay each other. People in these neighborhoods that are deemed food deserts are not, laying down and taking it. There is a very strong and growing food justice movement. And I think I mentioned, my food justice class at Tufts is extremely popular. People want to know what we can do about this. And organizations like Just Food have come up with the idea that food justice is communities exercising their right to grow, sell, and eat food that is fresh, nutritious, affordable, culturally appropriate, and grown locally with the care of the land, workers, and animals in mind. And essential to this food justice movement's analysis is an understanding of this idea of the food system as a racial project, and an understanding that we cannot separate hunger from previous generations of racist urban planning. There's a thriving range of organizations in the food justice movement now, from the Restaurant Opportunities Center. We have to remember that the food chain from fields to restaurants is about 60 to 70% immigrants and undocumented workers. We've got the Food Chain Workers Alliance, the Association of Immokalee Workers, Food First, many, many, many organizations who are really trying to almost re-articulate food justice, not simply about food, but also about jobs, good jobs, jobs that can replace those that have been the result of declining manufacturing industries. So food justice, again, isn't simply about food, just as environmental justice isn't simply about the environment. It's also about revisioning society almost towards Green New Deal kind of ideals. Now, I also want you to think about food as performance. It's interesting because I teach my class and I've got half urban planning students, half nutrition students. The nutrition students, they're interested in molecules and physiology and how food, keeps us healthy. I'm interested in that as well, but I'm also interested in what the anthropologists call foodways, manifestations and symbols of our cultural history. We all participate. Just think for 5-10 seconds about your own culture and your own cultural history, and think about the ways that your year is prompted by food-related ceremonies. We perform our identities, our memberships, our families, we perform our groups, and we perform our racial identities through the food that we eat. So yes, food is an intimate commodity. It's something we take inside us and it nourishes us. But to think of food only in those terms is to diminish the potential role of food as something that brings us together. We all are fascinated by what each other eats. And I think the potential in that is absolutely huge. And unfortunately, that's a whole nother lecture. Let me take some pot shots at some concepts that we use in food and food studies. This obsession with local foods. What are local foods? I'm a geographer. You're planners. Maybe some of you are geographers as well. There is no such thing as local. There is no signboard at the end of a town saying you are now leaving local and going regional or national. Local is whatever we can persuade each other what it is. I mean, we've had these books on the 100-mile diet, and we've talked about different diets and eating locally. But what are local foods in an intercultural society? let me introduce you to George and Julia Bowling, farmers in Maryland. And this was actually an NPR piece that I picked up on, and I decided to research it. So they're two tobacco farmers in Maryland. The state of Maryland is trying to get people out of tobacco farming and to diversify. So George and Julia are thinking, well, what are we going to do? And it comes across their desk that basically there are 150,000 Africans living in DC, many of them middle and upper middle class, diplomats, surgeons, professors, lawyers, and they want to eat locally grown African food. They don't want it thrown in frozen or whatever. They want to eat locally grown African food. So the Bowlings, being good American entrepreneurs, decide to do a little bit of research. Let's find out a bit about this. And they start talking to people within the African community in DC, and they talk to the University of Maryland Extension Service. Cut to the chase, there is now a booklet that the University of Maryland Extension produces on growing African crops in Maryland. It talks about what the crops are, the cultivation requirements, what the cultural significance of these foods is, how to cook them. On the left of the picture there is the signboard to George and Julia's farm, African produce, from tobacco to African produce. What are local foods? Are they what should be grown locally according to the very vociferous and predominantly ecologically focused local food movement that I've described? Or are they what the Africans want to eat locally? That's a question, you think about that. It's also something closer to your homes. In San Diego, as you might know, there's a large Filipino population. And Jimenez Valiente Neighbors did her PhD thesis looking at what Filipinos think of as local food. And basically, they think of it as whatever they grow in their yards and what they eat in their restaurants. And so really, I think what we can do is we can invoke this notion of translocalism. Immigrants bring their own local with them. In terms of landscape preferences, there's abundant evidence that a lot of immigrants go to landscapes that are reminiscent of where they're from. Why shouldn't they want to grow food that is reminiscent to them? Food is the umbilical link between where you're from and where you are now. So in trying to give you this contrast, we are obsessed, or the alternative food movement is obsessed with geographic localism as if they can define it, whereas what the immigrant groups are doing is defining a more culturally based localism, or this idea of translocalism. And again, if we want to build a bigger movement for food justice, for food security, for good food for everybody, then we should have a much more mature and reflexive conversation about what is local. Because there's a lot of knee-jerk reaction. That's not local food. That's not what really grows in Massachusetts. Well, if we really want to know what grows in Massachusetts, maybe we should ask the Wampanoag, the Nipmuc, and the Massachusetts people, rather than the European settlers who are starting to try and define what local is. Let's take a skip to the Greater Vancouver region in Canada. And you might not know this, but nearly 20% of farmers in the Greater Vancouver region are Chinese Canadians. And because of a history of anti-Chinese racism in Canada, together with their own entrepreneurial flair, they've developed a network of farmers markets that aren't the white middle-class farmers markets. It's a kind of what the authors of this paper, Gidd and Whitman, called parallel localism. Parallel localism. I'm not going to say who's right, who's wrong, or if those are even appropriate notions. But the point, I think, here is that a group of immigrants are redefining local, and they're redefining the primary economic locus of the alternative food movement, which is the farmers market. And I gave this talk 10 years ago in Vancouver, and a young East African woman came up to me after the talk and said, you know what, Julian, she said, I shop at the Chinese farmers markets because they grow the kind of food I want to eat. So what we're getting here is another form of food justice. I mean, often we think of food justice about food deserts, but here we are getting performances around food that are different and that cannot be explained, or the alternative food movement has difficulty even accepting them, let alone explaining these different expressions of what localism is. You, again, are closer to this than I am, but in LA, there used to be an amazing farm, the biggest farm, urban farm in the United States, called South Central Farms in LA, until it was bulldozed about 2006, I think. And these two women are in the farm. 96% of farmers were Latinx. And you can see here how they're not just growing culturally appropriate foods, they're growing it in a way that is reminiscent of their home in Oaxaca. I planted this garden because it's a little space like home. We grow the same plants that I had back in my garden in Oaxaca. We can eat like we ate at home, and this makes us feel like ourselves. It allows us to keep a part of who we are after coming to the United States. Do you get the point I'm making here? Local, significant, performance-based crops that give you succor in these xenophobic days are really important to immigrant groups. And so this idea of autotopography, which is the anthropologist's idea, is really about placemaking through food. They are making a place. They're not just growing things that they need, they're growing them in a way that is redolent of their homes. There's a network of 50 farms around the United States. This is New Roots in San Diego, but in Lowell, Massachusetts, we have New Entry Farms, which is partly run by Tufts University, New York, Burlington, Minneapolis, Phoenix. A lot of these cities are developing these farms for new immigrants, for people who want to come to the US, often as refugees, and to learn farming. And so there are some traditional farmers, there are new farmers. These kind of represent, in many ways, intercultural learning experiences. And I think they're very valuable as such. My latest book, The Immigrant Food Nexus, Borders, Labor and Identity in North America, incidentally co-edited by a former student of mine, who's now a PhD student at Brown University, Anthropology of Food. This really looks at the intersection of food and immigration. We can't talk about immigration policy without talking about food. If Trump had had his way and kicked out all the undocumented workers, our food system would collapse. Prices would go through the roof, food would be rotting in the fields. As I said, 60 to 70% of workers in the food system are immigrants. And some people think our food system is broken. It's not, it's working exactly as it intended to do, on exploitation, precarity, and insecurity. So this book really looks at both the national policy level on immigration and food policy, but it also looks at the daily spatial and social practices of immigrants and how they are coping in an increasingly xenophobic North America. And we did it on North America because there's about 3 or 4 chapters on Canada. Even given Canada's greater multiculturalism and its policy on multiculturalism, Canada's not a lot better. It exploits immigrant farmers slightly less, but not much less than we do in the US. Now, I want to talk about, before I finish, about 2 success stories. I did a piece of work with a colleague of mine, Penn Lowe, on this thriving, emergent local solidarity economy around food in Boston. Here's some of the projects: the Urban Farming Institute, the Food Project, the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative Food Hub, City Fresh Foods, Haley House City Growers, the Commonwealth Kitchen, which is a kitchen where a lot of the food trucks prepare their food, the Dorchester Food Co-op, and Zero, which is a Latinx African-American food composting cooperative. How does it work? Well, I mentioned Article 89 rezoning. What that did in 2013 was to create space for non-profit and for-profit urban farms in Boston. And it just so happens that a couple of community land trusts, which are run by the Dudley Street Neighbourhood Initiative, they developed into one non-profit and one for-profit farm. So you've got community land trust, government policy that rezoned the land. You've got the Urban Farming Institute, the Food Project, and many other growers. You've got the processors through City Fresh Foods and the Commonwealth Kitchen. You've got the Dorchester Food Co-op, many of Boston's high-end restaurants that get food from these organizations, and the Haley House Cafe, and then recycling that food and vegetable waste is the Zero Cooperative. So not only do you have a food solidarity economy, but you also are getting a developing food circular economy as well. Now, what's really interesting, and again, I can, for those of you who want to go deeper, I can give you all of the papers that I'm citing here. So if we can talk about that in a few minutes when I finish. But the point I want to make here is this is a laissez-faire agreement. These groups didn't say, hey, let's do this, let's join up, let's have a circular kind of industrial ecology thing going. It just happened in the good old American laissez-faire fashion. So the question we ask is, what if representatives from these groups and others got together and said, hey, how can we tighten this circular economy? How can we grow it out and up? And how can we bring in more jobs? We calculate 300-400 jobs in these organizations alone. Many of them, most of them go to local people, and these neighborhoods are low income and up to 70% minority. This is a major employment source, and these are good jobs. These are secure jobs. These are jobs with benefits. So they fulfill my criteria of just sustainabilities. This isn't just about environmental sustainability. This is about a just sustainability as well. And I want to finish on a very optimistic note. Some of you might know that in Boston, between September and November, we are having mayoral elections. At the moment, there's an interim mayor, Marty Walsh. The previous elected mayor has been taken by Joe Biden to be Labour Secretary. And so stepping in was the president of the council, Kim Rainey, who is the first Black mayor, but not elected. She's interim. There are 6 candidates for mayor, 2 men, 4 women, and all are of color. This is an amazing moment for Boston. I've been in Boston 20 years, and I didn't know or think whether this moment would come. My allegiance is to Michelle Wu. I've been helping her. My food justice class has been helping her with this amazing food justice agenda for a resilient Boston. For those of you who've ever looked at urban food plans, food action plans, take a look at this. This is radically unique. And you would expect so, because Michelle is a progressive Democrat. She is, in line with Ayanna Pressley, with AOC and the Squad. And the reason I'm pulling out this is because I really want to make my final point very clear. Unless we start with an analysis that locates the real problem, then how do we build solutions? She starts by saying, food justice means racial justice, demanding a clear-eyed understanding of how white supremacy has shaped our food systems. This is a politician, not a radical non-profit group. This is a potential politician. She talks about how Black, Latinx, Indigenous, AAPI communities haven't enjoyed equal access to nutritious foods. And she talks about public health, small businesses, economic justice and workers' rights, closing the racial wealth gap. She uses food justice as a lens to look at bigger economic and social and racial justice issues. So I do urge you, and again, you just need to go to her website, take a look at this. It is a radically different plan. And if she became mayor, and even if she implemented only 50% of this, we would be in a much more food secure Boston. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Julian. Really appreciate you speaking with us today. We do have time for question and answer. Julian's willing to hang around for a while. So I want to encourage everyone to please take this opportunity to ask a question when you have an internationally recognized expert right here in front of you. If you want to raise your hand, I will call on you. Either I can see the full screen, so you can raise your actual hand or your virtual hand. You can also put your questions in chat. And so there's one in chat. So let me start there. And it's from Riley, and it says, since you use this term, I'm curious, what makes food culturally appropriate?
Well, there's various, some people say culturally relevant, some say culturally appropriate. Every culture has foods that are part of its culture. That's quite simply what culturally appropriate or culturally relevant means. In many cases, you know, no attention has been paid to the appropriateness of certain foods for certain cultures. Now, you could say that these are preferences rather than physiological needs, and I would absolutely agree. But we're in a phase where recognition, you know, Black Lives Matter, say her name, don't yuck my yum. All of these are really, really important in recognizing that we live in cities of difference where cultural identity demands that we adopt a position of cultural humility. And so that's a long way around, but culturally relevant, I think, is, you know, culturally relevant, culturally appropriate is, you know, the phrase that is commonly used.
Thanks. I see Julia. Julia, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. So you had mentioned a little bit earlier that the food system was working as it was intended, despite many people seeing the system as broken. I was wondering how you would approach like a revitalization of a local food system to create more sustainable and accessible food. Like what issue would you start with when creating like a more comprehensive local food plan?
Well, again, I would you know, urge you to take a look at Michelle Wu's plan. Where do you start? Well, you know, you start by locating the problem, and the problem is that it is not by accident that food deserts exist. Call them what you will. It's not by accident that some people are going hungry. So we have to locate food injustice, food insecurity, I think, in a socioeconomic system that is deeply inequitable and deeply racialized. One city in Brazil, Belo Horizonte, has the moniker, the name, the city that abolished hunger, according to Francis Moore Lappé, the food writer. This is a city, remember, in a capitalist nation, Brazil. It's a city of about 4 to 6 million, and it's created its own food system. The city has fixed the price of certain foods that private sector retailers have to sell to people on benefits, people on low incomes. It's set up a chain of people's restaurants where food is available, a meal is available for around about $1.50 US. I visited one when I went to Belo Horizonte. The city is making available unused city land for urban agriculture. And I went to a conference, and a young woman was presenting who had previously been homeless with her kids, who'd heard about this city program, who'd got trained, now sells the food, organic food, from her plot to her kids' school and trains other women. Local farmers from the hinterlands, the peri-urban areas and the rural areas are given access to places to sell within the city. So the city has created its own local food system. How did it do this? 1992, there was a mayor, Patras Ananias, who himself had grown up in food insecurity. And wanted to create a food system in the city such that nobody would go hungry. They based it around social justice, the Brazilian constitutional right to food, and food with dignity. And I think those three, if you start building a food system from those three precepts, you're going to build a food system that looks good and feeds people well. In a similar way to what I said about Michelle Wu, she starts her analysis, food justice is racial justice, and that we need to decenter white supremacy from local food systems. So this is a long way about it, Julia, but you've got to start with the right analysis. So I would think about, and a lot of people are asking questions, why don't US cities do what Belo Horizonte is doing? 1 to 2% of the city's budget is all that it takes. I could imagine, I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a very progressive go-ahead authority. You could see that the city could afford to do something really ambitious with, say, Whole Foods or some other sort of food producer. You could understand that that might happen. You could think about cities, you know, helping the Restaurant Opportunities Centre, which has a set of policies which are called high road policies rather than low road policies. I mean, most workers in the food, in food retail are paid minimum or below minimum wage. It's been shown that paying workers better gets a better performance, they stay with you longer. There are so many factors and so many places to start, Julia, but I would start with the Belo Horizonte analysis, building a food system from a right to food, social justice and food with dignity, building a food system from an understanding that the reason why people aren't getting good food is often because of socioeconomic prejudice and racial prejudice.
Can I ask a quick question, Michael?
Yeah, go ahead, Vicente.
Thank you so much for the incredible presentation, such an important theme. It just occurred to me to ask you a question. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more. What's your vision? I mean, from my understanding, the food inequality and the problems we see in food distribution are very similar to the access to food is very similar to the problem we have in access to housing, right? I think that they're intermingled. And how can you develop a little bit about that relationship? Because I think that's, and as you can see from my accent, I'm not from the US. So I see that one of the problems here is recognizing those two as real problems, social problems, and attack them as social problems. As a social democracy, for instance, would do that. So I think access to housing is tied to access to food as well.
Well, Vicente, great point. But I wouldn't even add the word housing. I would just say access is the issue.
Yep, there you go. Access, yeah.
It really, the more, like you, the more I think about it, the more access is. It is in so many ways the issue that we are dealing with. You know, I know Cornelius is in transportation. One thing I'm thinking about at the moment, I'm by no means an expert, but I've got a student working on this. I read a really interesting piece recently talking about how ridership as a measurement, ridership in public transit is going down. You know, since Uber, Lyft, and then so the cumulative effect of Uber and Lyft, and then COVID. And yet we keep using ridership as a metric for urban transit. And so this article was saying, hang on, let's change the metric, change the narrative. Let's look at access-based measurements for public transit, because people are demanding, people want public transit. But if we keep measuring ridership, then the right is going to win all the time by saying we need to defund public transit, nobody's using it, ridership's going down, let's be done with it. If we can develop more creative access-based measurements, satisfaction-based measurements, demand-based measurements. So I think the issue of access, period, is a huge issue for urban planning. But we never really think about it as an issue in itself. We think of access to food or access to housing or access to transportation. Let's develop a class on access. A great point, Vicente, and I'm happy to talk offline more about that if you are.
Other questions? Let's see, Michael, go ahead.
Hi, Professor. Thanks for the lecture. My senior project this quarter, I'm writing a proposal for an urban farm in Aurora, Colorado called Delaney, which has focused on refugees and training them in sort of experimental urban farm techniques. And as I'm doing the final writing for this project, I'm having trouble. My experience with the farm has been subjective because I've worked with them for a couple years and sort of just been part of that community. But I'm having trouble finding, I guess, scholarly work on the benefits of that to a refugee community here. And I wrote down the Immigrant Food Nexus, so I'm definitely gonna check that out. But if you have any other recommendations, I would.
Hey, listen, I'm going to, you know, I'm going to spoil my my royalties on this. It's actually open access, so you can get it open access. So you know, if you just Google Immigrant Food Nexus open access or common source or something, but MIT Press has done it open access, so that you know. So take a look at that. Yeah, look into the work of. Teresa Mares at University of Vermont. Look into the work of, she's at Syracuse. My mother calls them senior moments. It's just I'm having them too frequently. Michael, I'll give you a list. There's a lot of people, a lot in California actually as well, but a lot of people doing work on, especially immigrants, less so refugees, but you should also check out this, you know, like New Roots Farm in San Diego. There's a whole movement, I think, around difference and urban agriculture, how different groups are expressing themselves through issues of food and food access. So yeah, I can give you a list of people. If you email me, I'll give you a list of people that you might want to check out. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Additional questions? Kelly.
Yes, hi, thank you. That was a great lecture. So many of our students here will be soon entering the field of planning in California particularly, and entering departments that basically have been practicing racist urban planning of sorts for a long period of time. And even if our students enter with an understanding of what you're talking about, right, which is an analysis of the underlying problems, you know, what would you recommend they do to be sort of changed within the machine? Because I think that's a real challenge.
Kelly, absolutely. And, you know, it's interesting because ours is a graduate only program, and, you know, several alums have said to me, you know, Julian, what I'd really like is, you know, we should have alumni weeks in summer or weekends where we can come back and get recharged, you know, regather the spirit of change, because as soon as you get into a job, you know, you get sucked into the vortex of delivering results, and all of our idealism kind of goes. Look for allies, look for leaders. Look at many of the non-profits now are articulating exactly what I'm saying. And there are groups within, you know, planners of color or just other planning groups that are really starting to try and challenge mainstream planning to see some of these issues. Take a look at Minneapolis 2040. You know, in a different lecture, I talk about the Minneapolis Paradox, about how Minneapolis is a super green city, you know, parks, top park system, cycling, running tracks, everything. So it's a super green city, but underneath that, the legacy of racist planning has made it one of the most unequal cities in the US, and the most unequal in terms of the wealth gap. home ownership. So Minneapolis has got a young, progressive city council, and they're really trying to do something about it. First thing they did was, get rid of single-family zoning in favor of duplexes and triplexes, and that was 70% of the urban city land. So there are cities trying to do things. Read up on what some cities are trying to do. Take a look at Michelle Wu's food justice agenda. Take a look at her plan for the Boston Planning and Development Authority and how she intends to make it a more community-based planning process in Boston. It's traditionally been the arm of the mayor, basically. It's been for mayoral pet projects. So I think there's a lot of information around, but it is difficult when you are the most junior person to start articulating some of these ideals. And again, that's why my slide on Michelle Wu was about leadership. Imagine you have a mayor who understands, who gets it. And I worry at times that in the US, what we have is mayors who are basically what I call jugglers. They juggle between the needs of the unions, white and upper middle class vocal opponents, and developers. And mayors are essentially jugglers. Where is the mayor with the vision, like Jaime Lerner in Curitiba back in the 70s, like the mayor of Belo Horizonte that I mentioned, like the mayors of Medellin in Colombia? It's no coincidence that a lot of these mayors are Latin American. And I mean, remember in Medellin, they had their philosophy is called social urbanism. It bears great resemblance to my idea of just sustainabilities. And so I think we're in this gap period at the moment where a lot of students coming out of universities are going to be aware of these issues, but people who've been in planning for a while and are just sitting there doing nothing are not likely to be your allies. You have to find allies. And a lot of what I've been saying is known. It's just I've put some rather more emotional words like white supremacy and racist urban planning. I mean, but a lot of what I've said is not unique. It's just that I've really come to a point in my career where we have to call it out for what it is. Because unless we call it out for what it is, we're not going to build from that. Take a look at Michelle Wu's food justice plan and then take a look at the Seattle Food Action Plan. I mean, Seattle's a progressive city, but it shilly-shallies around the points. It doesn't really name the problem. It talks about wherever possible, when resources permit. No, that's not good enough anymore. Call it out and let's do something about it, because we know what to do. We're just not doing it. And so students, I wish I could bring you a more hopeful message. You are going in as junior people, but don't lose the enthusiasm. I mean, we've come a long way. And on May the 20th last year, 9 minutes and 27 seconds of the most excruciating, painful human experience that I've ever experienced means we can't go back. We cannot go back. We can only go forward. And I think it's and I'm not putting it all on you. You're always we in the academy, we vocal professors who are tenured and who can say what we want, we're always going to have your back. And we're going to keep saying these things until change happens.
Thanks, Julian. I really appreciate that comment about allies as well. I think that's really the key. You can't do it on your own. You've got to build these allies and partners, and sometimes it's not obvious who they are. You have to go looking for them, people that share your message and share your vision.
And you might find allies in the most unexpected places.
Mm-hmm.
You might find that, person who's been in the planning department for 20 to 30 years and who just needs that little bit of energy that you bring in to revitalize their once radical ideas. Mm-hmm. Just go in there and do that.
Great. I see Cornelius's hands up. Cornelius?
Yes, so I mean, it's basically 12 o'clock. I just wanted to give a remark rather than ask a question. Thank you very much for a very informative presentation. The two lessons I got from this: one, that what in transportation we call accessibility. Accessibility is the key here, and you already said it: housing, transport, food, education. You know, we can go on, and that's what's going to make the difference. You know, the equity in accessibility. The second lesson is that maybe as educators, special educators of planners, we need to change our mode from the philosophy of what needs to be done to the pragmatism of what should be done. The examples you gave, for instance, you know, Belo Horizonte, Curitiba. When I'm teaching transportation classes and I want to show what has worked well, I show what, you know, I mean, when I want to really indoctrinate the students, I show them what has examples of what has worked well. Maybe that's what we as educators should be doing now, more and more, indoctrinating the students into, you know, the confidence that things have been done well. There are examples, they carry those in their toolbox, and they go out and become advocates for programs, not so much of plans anymore. And so that's what one of the remarks I wanted to make.
Cornelius, I couldn't agree more. I try not to use the word indoctrination, I've got to say. Persuasion or suggestion, but yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. And you know what's amazing about Curitiba is it stood the test of time. I mean, this was 50 years ago when Jaime Lerner was a architect planner, and then he became the mayor. And now people from all around the world still go to Curitiba to see how they did it. And bus rapid transit, the Barr Foundation in Boston, Boston's wealthiest foundation, has funded the ITDP to do a feasibility study for Boston on BRT. So, yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Let's look at exemplars, and let's learn from, and especially when we're learning from, the global South. I think that's really important.
If I may, just one last one. Since Julian gave me a little bit more reason to be proud of my own citizenship, because I'm from Brazil, in a time that I've been very depressed with everything that's going down there. I just wanted to show you one, if I can share my screen, one experience that goes right into what you're saying, that I got. Well, can you let me share my screen, Mike? Okay, thanks. Because it's a very interesting experience of urban agriculture. Can you see it?
Yeah.
It's a squatter settlement in Rio that had this land preserved under the high power transmission lines, and the city supported them in that urban agricultural farm. And that farm is feeding 800 families in the squatter settlement, and it's run by them. So it was a community participation process. So I think some things give us a little bit more hope in the future. And yes, I think accessibility is all, including accessibility to work in planning departments and make the change happen.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, that's great. It's a great example. And, I mean, here in Boston, we have, a nationally or even internationally recognized nonprofit called the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, which is the only nonprofit in the US to ever have been given eminent domain powers. And they have completely, in over 40 years now, since the early 80s. They've completely revitalized the Dudley Square neighborhood in Roxbury and Dorchester, and have built maker spaces, they've built affordable housing, they've hosted these 2 urban farms that I mentioned. And one thing that's really interesting about them, and I think another key point for your students, Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative looks like the community. Before they set up the organization, they did a demographic analysis and they configured the board of directors to look like the community demographically. So everybody has a voice. Also, you have to be elected, and there are certain slots for different cultural and ethnic groups. So it's an organization that has developed the trust of the local community. It's developed the trust of the city council. It is beloved by funders because it's so representative. So I think authenticity and representation help accessibility, and projects that come from a place of authenticity and a well-represented nonprofit or a well-represented planning department in a community might have a greater chance of thinking about notions of accessibility than if the community doesn't look like. And let me just leave you with one thought. Minneapolis police, 93% don't live in Minneapolis. Boston police have a requirement, a residency requirement. And I was just talking to a group of people and thinking, what if in a de-escalation situation, you're in Boston and there's a group of youths and there's the police, somebody's going to say, he went to school with my brother or my cousin. And you just have a greater opportunity in a de-escalation situation where you have a residency requirement, where somebody might recognize somebody and the human element comes in. That's not so much possible in Minneapolis, where 93% of the police are from the suburbs rather than from the city of Minneapolis. I just put that there because I think what our planning departments, what our nonprofits look like is going to be very, very, very much more important in the future. People want to see themselves in the nonprofit, in the planning department. That helps build trust. That helps, I think, build accessibility.
Thanks, Julian. I know some of you have to run to class, and I think Dr. Aygeman's probably willing to hang around for a few more minutes. I see Kelly, you have your hand up. I know you got to run as well. So do you want to ask a question?
Well, yes, I guess maybe make a point or put a couple of thoughts together that I'm hearing. I respond well to your concern with using the term indoctrination, because I think what we've been doing for a long time in planning schools is teaching answers to people, right? Yeah. And it's important to teach examples and answers. I mean, you know, it's great. But I think part of the problem with that is that there's a danger in not teaching humility, to listen to the community. And I think when we talk about access, we have to talk about access to power. And because we don't have the answers all the time, even if we came from whatever school with great examples and et cetera. So I guess I would just, I think, and I think it goes back to your comment about allies and finding allies. I think, you know, community engagement is one of the answers to some of these issues, and a great way to find allies. And I guess that's just the point.
Absolutely, couldn't agree with you more. You know, your point's very well taken. I mean, this idea that we're teaching answers, absolutely. A lot of students come in, give me the toolkit, I'll go out and do good things. When we're teaching answers, but we're not getting people to ask the right questions. And asking the right questions usually means asking those difficult questions about equity and social justice. And, you know, so I very much, you know, in front of students will say, look, we don't have all of the answers, but some people, you know, outside our profession may well have all sorts of ways that we could explore. I'm becoming very interested in the concept of co-production. think about a park. A park is designed, managed, and programmed. What about co-design, co-management, and co-production and co-programming of parks? So this idea of co-production, I think, is useful. It helps build trust, and it helps build humility amongst urban planners and designers and parks managers. But again, I do think this idea of making sure we ask the right questions is so important. And that concept you mentioned of humility. And just to really finally add, issues of humility, dignity, empathy, that's where our planning processes should be going. Planning that does not increase human dignity is not planning that we want to be associated with. But yet so much of our policy making here in the US is predicated around taking away dignity from people, whether it's defensive architecture that humiliates homeless people, whether it's the rich doors, poor doors, which makes the poor people go around the back, whereas the rich come in the boulevards and go in the high-speed elevators up to the penthouses. We are, we are passive. We are passively sometimes as urban planners involved in increasing human indignity. And, so I think dignity, humility, empathy are things that we really need to focus on. And, if I'd have given you my just sustainability talk, I would have talked exactly about this. We talk about human scale planning. I don't. I talk about humane scale planning. I put an E on the word human. That's what I want to see, humane scale planning. It's probably a good time to leave, isn't it, Michael? Leave them wanting more. Always leave them wanting more.
Yes. Yeah. Julian, thank you again so much for this informative talk and taking some time to answer questions for us. Very much appreciated. I'll follow up with you later about some other things.
Yeah, but just to say to your students, look, if anybody wants any of the papers that I mentioned, please let me know, and I'll send you them, Michael, and you can then distribute them.
Great.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you for everyone who attended, and have a good rest of your day.